Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Schearer, theprez98, and I'll be talking about drones today, but specifically the law of drones. In other words, the legal aspects of flying drones, about doing things with your drone, sort of a little bit of history of drones, as well as the history of airspace and that sort of thing, and what is the current state of the law, as well as a number of current applications that you may have seen in the news and things like that. And then I'll leave a little bit of time for questions, because I'm sure you'll have some. So, a little bit about myself. I spent almost 9 years in the United States Navy as a naval flight officer, doing electronic countermeasures in EA-6B Prowler, so electronic attack, jamming, that sort of thing. About 1,000 hours in the aircraft. I currently work for Booz Allen Hamilton. I'm a network analyst, a government contractor, and I'm a fourth-year law student at the University of Maryland. So I'll be graduating in May, finally. So you may notice in the picture that I'm sitting in the plane that's an ejection seat, and above my head and behind my head there's a yellow and black cable. If you pull that, you go through the canopy, so don't pull that unless you really want to exit the aircraft. If you ever go to an air show, you get to go into a cockpit, anything that is black and yellow, don't touch it. So one of the things that I like to talk about in my talks, or one of the things that I like to preface in my talks, is why you should be skeptical of the things I'm talking about. And the reason is that while I do this a lot, while I do drones, while I deal with legal issues of drones, there's probably someone out there who's smarter than me. So I don't necessarily know everything that I'm talking about. I think I do, but I might be wrong. I'm not a lawyer. I'm close to being a lawyer, about 85% of the way there, but I'm not a lawyer. So there may be issues that I don't necessarily understand fully, but I think I understand them pretty well enough to talk about them. And secondly, it's just something that I think is important to stress in the talk, that, maybe I'm an expert, maybe I'm not, but it's important if you have questions about things that I've said, question me about it. Raise a hand and ask a question. One of the things I want to start off with before I give the bulk of my talk is terminology. There's a long, ongoing debate in the community, in the drone community, about what to call drones. And these are, and there's good reason for this. A decade ago, if you heard the word drone, you're thinking of a Predator UAV flying over Afghanistan or Yemen and taking out some, Al-Qaeda terrorist. So when people talk about using drones, something like this, which is certainly not going to, shoot a Hellfire missile, they don't necessarily want the connotations, the negative connotations that come along with that. So these are just some of the words that people in the community have suggested for alternative names for drones. For the purpose of this presentation, I'm using drones because it's easy. But crone, really? Commercial drone, like who would use that? Unmanned aerial vehicle, UAV, unmanned aerial system, small unmanned aerial system, remote piloted aircraft, remote piloted vehicle, remote piloted aerial system. Skynet's not really one, I just added that because I thought. Doesn't mean I endorse the term drone, but for the purposes of this presentation, that's what I'll be using. So I want to talk a little bit about history. And anybody here take Latin in high school? Okay, a few of you. So there's a doctrine that's abbreviated to ad colum, which basically means who's ever in the soil, it is theirs, all the way to the heaven and all the way to hell. This is old common law doctrine, developed probably in the Middle Ages. And it essentially meant that if you owned property, you owned everything above it and everything below it. And we still see a little bit of this today. If you own property and you have oil or mineral under your property, you can lease those rights to an oil company. The air side is a little bit interesting because up until maybe the late 1700s, there really was no challenge to the air side, right? I mean, there was nobody doing anything in the air over your property. But then along came these guys. Late 1800s, people started flying hot air balloons. Turn of the century into the 20th century, the Wright brothers started flying around in heavier-than-air aircraft. And suddenly we have an issue with this doctrine. That's the idea of flying above someone's property. What can you do above someone's property? What if you're 50 feet or 100 feet or 5,000 feet? So this doctrine underwent a challenge. And this was a case at the end of World War II from a chicken farmer in North Carolina whose farm was adjacent to an Army airfield where they were doing training flights for the military. And they were flying all day long over his farm. At about 83 feet was what they calculated. The chickens are going crazy. They're killing themselves. They're doing all because they can't. They're just all this noise. So he sued the United States government for a property violation. And the court said that the doctrine had no place in the modern world, so they kind of threw it out. But they did say that they were flying so low, 83 feet, that the government should compensate him for the damages that were caused. And the doctrine that came out of this case is known as the enveloping atmosphere. And what this means is that if you have a piece of property, you own the air over your property to the extent that you can actively use it. In other words, if you have a ham radio tower on your property that goes up to 150 feet, well, then you own the airspace up to 150 feet. Now, there may be code reasons why you can't go higher than that or, at certain areas, but whatever you can use is the enveloping atmosphere. So that's sort of the current state of the law as it applies to drones. And we'll get into that more as we see some more modern cases. So that's really the history, in a nutshell, of air rights, or rights to the air over a piece of property. There's a lot more detail than that, but that should give you an idea of where we're going. I want to talk about the National Airspace System because now we're talking about integrating an object like this, or something bigger or smaller, into the National Airspace System. The National Airspace System is, we're going to focus on the United States here, the airspace that's controlled by the government under the authority of the FAA. Our airspace looks something like this. It's divided into classes. And depending upon what class of airspace you're in, there are different rules. The ones that I want to talk about in detail are Class A, which is the red at the top. That's everything over 18,000 feet. This is all IFR, meaning Instrument Flight Rules. This is where you fly when you came to Derbycon, probably. No drones are going to be flying up there. No hobby drones are going to be flying up there. The other one I want to talk about is Class B Airspace. This is the large yellow one that looks like an upside-down wedding cake. If you think of Class B, think of busy airport, right? So busy airports have Class B airspace. So you have a certain amount of airspace, and the further you go up in altitude, the wider the airspace becomes. Here in Louisville, there's Class C airspace, so it's a little bit smaller. But those are important because to fly into Class B or Class C airspace, you need to talk to air traffic control. Well, that might be difficult for someone on the ground with a drone who doesn't have a radio on the aircraft or even to talk to. So how do you deal with that? That's something we'll talk about as well. This is just a little bit of a part of Class B airspace around BWI Airport. This is Baltimore Washington International, which is between Baltimore and Washington, D.C. Maybe a little difficult to see, but there's a bunch of concentric circles. You can see, and I have them circled in red, and that tells you the low and high altitudes for that concentric circle. So, for example, the furthest one out is 100 over 35. So what that means is the Class B airspace goes up to 10,000 feet and starts at 3,500 feet. So if you are out here on the right side of the map, you can fly up to 3,500 feet without being in the Class B airspace. When you get into the next circle, it is 25, then 15. So you can see how it's getting lower and lower. Think of it again as an upside down wedding cake with the airport in the middle. The further you get away, the higher and the further out it goes. In 2003, the FAA promulgated a flight restricted zone around the District of Columbia. So this is actually larger than the BWI airspace. This is a temporary flight restriction enacted in 2003. This extends, I think, 25 miles from the District of Columbia and goes from the surface, starts at the surface and goes as high as they want it to go. So this actually covers where I live. So by the strict interpretation of the FAA rules, I can't fly a drone in my backyard because of these rules, even though I'm 45-minute drive away from DC. And this is the sort of, so we'll talk about the drone crash at the White House lawn, but the company who manufactures this drone, DJI, actually started updating the firmware to have essentially geofences. So if you turn on your drone and it gets a GPS sync in this area, it won't take off. Don't update the firmware. This is the Louisville Class C airspace. You can see the airport in the middle, and it's a little bit odd. There's a little section that goes out of on the side, but in the inside circle, it's the surface to 4,500 feet, and the outside circle is, there's different sections, 1,700 and 2,200. So that's just a very brief primer on the National Airspace System to give you an idea of the things that someone has to think about before they want to fly a drone. So if you want to fly a drone and you live within 5 miles of an airport, probably good to think about what you're doing before you do it, especially when you might be on the approach vector. Most people who buy commercial drones are not thinking about that. Back in 2012, Congress passed a law called the FAA Modernization and Reform Act, and what this law did was, this was the first regulation of unmanned aerial systems, and it essentially deals with commercial uses of drones. In other words, if you want to make money off your drone flying, if you want to use your drone for weddings or funerals or whatever, there are rules that you have to follow. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And it made a special exemption for model aircraft, which drones fall under the exemption for model aircraft, if you're using the drone for hobby or recreational purposes. The FAA put out an advisory circular in 1981 that dealt with model aircraft, and these were the rules that the FAA promulgated. Hobby and recreational use only, staying under 400 feet, notifying the tower when you're within 3 miles of an airfield. Note the notify, not ask permission, notify, and follow a community-based safety guidelines. And there are organizations out there, trade organizations that for people who fly model aircraft, and they have community guidelines and all sorts of things. In 1981, there weren't really drones like this, but now there are, and they generally fall under those sorts of rules. The FAA actually updated that circular in about 3 weeks ago. So from 1981 to 3 weeks ago. Basically had the same rules, except they extended it from 3 miles to 5 miles. And they stressed enforcement actions that the FAA can take. So while Congress said that model aircraft are exempt, the FAA still maintains that they can enforce dangerous flying. When an executive branch agency like the FAA wants to promulgate rules, they have to post a notice of proposed rulemaking. And you may be familiar with regulations.gov. You can go there, you can type in any subject, and the agencies will post proposed rules, and you can make comments on them if you want. The FAA proposed a rule for certification. It closed in April. And again, this rule only applies to commercial uses. So what if you wanted to fly a drone for commercial uses right now? According to the law, you'd have to apply for what's called a Section 333 exemption from the FAA and explain what you're going to do for your business, and they're actually approving them pretty quickly now. But then to actually fly the drone for commercial use, you have to have a private pilot's license. Under the current rules, if you want to make money from your drone, you have to have a private pilot's license to be the pilot of the drone. No. So I'll talk about one enforcement action that the FAA has taken a little bit later, but they are being very hands-off right now because they know that they're going to get slapped down as soon as it happens. So this rule, the proposed rule the rule that they're proposing, would do away with the pilot license requirement, but you would have to take some kind of like FAA test, learning about the airspace and that sort of thing. It's a little bit less onerous than it would be right now, although they are approving them pretty quickly right now. Even giving that under the proposed rule, stay under 500 feet, line of sight, meaning you can't fly out of where you can see, which is a big problem for companies like Amazon.com, and only during daytime. So this really limits what you can do. I can tell you these will be challenged the minute they get published in the Federal Register. So there's really only one case where the FAA brought in enforcement action against somebody. There's a guy named Raphael Pirker, and he was hired to fly a drone at a university in Virginia to capture video and photographs for a university advertising campaign. The FAA originally ruled against, so he flew his drone around, and there were apparently some people on the ground who were scared of it, so they complained to the FAA, and the FAA said that you violated the rule that you have to fly safely. You were flying low over people's heads, you flew too close to buildings, et cetera, et cetera. Administrative law judge for the FAA, let me back up. The FAA finding against him was based upon the fact that the word aircraft, as defined by the federal government, includes something like this. Administrative law judge reversed it, saying this is a model aircraft, not an aircraft. And the National Transportation Safety Board reversed again, saying a model aircraft is an aircraft. All these decisions are about definitions. What is a model aircraft and what is an aircraft? Because if something is not an aircraft, the FAA doesn't have authority over it. Even after the NTSB reversed, this case was settled, so they tried to fine him $10,000. He ended up paying $1,000 to settle the case. And the important factor here is this case never reached an Article III court. So let me give you a little bit of background. All the enforcement actions against him were done by an executive branch agency. If he wanted to appeal the NTSB case, it would go to a federal district court, an Article III court, a judicial branch court. So this case, because it was settled and because it was done by an executive branch, doesn't really have any authority. So it's really unsettled. Nobody knows what the answers to these questions are. I'm just going to run through a bunch of pictures of issues that you may have seen in the news over the last few years, just to give you an idea of this isn't just some person in the backyard flying a drone. There's a lot of potential uses, good and bad, for this sort of activity. This one. You may have seen this one. So there's a guy that works for the National Reconnaissance Office, an intelligence agency of the United States government, who goes to a party in Washington, D.C., gets drunk, and decides that he's going to fly his buddy's drone around downtown Washington, D.C. While drunk, flies the drone, loses control of the drone, doesn't know where the drone went, wakes up in the morning and sees that a drone has crashed on the White House lawn, and does the finally smart thing and calls them up and says, "That was me." So this was a DJI Phantom, just like the one I have here. His suffered some damage, and I think there was a mild enforcement action against him eventually, but it wasn't a big deal. But this was this sort of propelled drones into the news, at least in the last year, more so than anything else. Drones carrying drugs. How many of you have seen cases where drones have crashed around the border trying to carry drugs across the border? This is a larger drone, but obviously they packed it with too many drugs. I mean, obviously they weren't good engineers because they wouldn't have happened this way. Amazon wants to deliver packages. You've seen their videos. Again, going back to the commercial uses are line of sight. So how can Amazon fly a drone from 5 miles or 10 miles away from your house if it's not line of sight? So those current restrictions are essentially prohibiting Amazon from doing this. So what are they doing? They're going to Canada, they're going to Europe, they're going to other places where they can do testing because they can't do it here in the United States.
The military has now, right? Because they have drone operators, pilots.
Right.
Not line of sight.
Right, exactly. So what he's saying, making a comment about is that the military have pilots do all this, and so military drones operate in an entirely different legal spectrum. So the current rules are sort of in this case, are sort of holding back innovation from happening. This is a pretty interesting one. This comes out of Lebanon, the country of Lebanon, but I've seen this in Australia too, where they have drones on the beach with life preservers, and when they have swimmers in distress, they just fly them out before the lifeguard can get there. So at least they have something to, something to hold off the guy until somebody can get to them. I've also seen drones. They've done drone testing with AEDs and other medical devices. So these are things that are sort of testing. They're not really in production yet, but they're certainly good possibilities. This is called the Guardian, by the way, if you can read. So there have been a number of cases, especially in California, about drones interfering with firefighting operations. Some of these cases, shockingly, have been overblown. In one case, it turned out that one of these fires happened in an area where people actively fly drones. So it's not like they just showed up and said, hey, let's go fly over the fire. This was an area, a large open area that was very popular with drone flyers, and the fire just happened to, happen in that area. But there are cases where drones have interrupted firefighting operations. So that's an issue. That's something that has to be regulated. And the more times things like this happen, then you can just imagine the heavy hand of regulation coming down. There are crash-proof drones. This drone, crash-proof. This drone has essentially a cage around it so that it can bump into things and it won't interrupt the propellers. This won $1 million, by the way, at a competition. There are drone film festivals. There's one in New York City. There's a couple different ones. And if you watch some of the videos, they're really pretty cool. I don't know if you guys ever watch HGTV or those house hunter shows. If you see some of those shows, after you watch them a while, you'll start seeing shots and realize that was done with a drone, that was done with a drone. I mean, it's all over the place. There's also privacy issues, surprisingly, to dealing with drones. I think this was from Colorado, where there's a town that was proposing to issue drone hunting permits for people to shoot down drones. You can see the issues here. Aside from the drones, I think those of you who are active in the firearms community know that shooting it generally into the air is not a good idea, and is generally going to get you at the least a disorderly conduct or a reckless endangerment charge no matter what you're doing. Then there's this guy. Johnny Drone Hunter, Defender of Privacy. Okay. This is real. Well, I mean, it's some guy, I guess. I mean, how many of you have or have seen a GoPro camera? Most people don't understand this, but you know because you have them. It's a wide-angle lens, right? And so if I were to turn on the camera here, just for you guys, I mean, it would look further away than I'm standing from you. These are not things that you use to invade someone's privacy. And I'll show you a couple videos of what a drone looks like flying at 200 feet. And you ask me if, and, you know, I'll ask you, is that invading someone's privacy? Interactions with government and law enforcement. This was actually a picture taken from a drone, not mine, but taken from someone in the drone community who was flying, and the police happened to pull up. And they actually, so you might think this turns out poorly, but it didn't. They actually challenged him to land it on the police car. And he politely declined, which was a smart idea. But they actually thought it was cool. The majority of law enforcement that I've talked to don't seem to have a problem with drones. I did deal with one park ranger who was trying to enforce a model aircraft rule, so I politely walked away. But most people that I've talked to, and I did a survey, informal survey among people in the drone community, and found that most people's interactions with government and law enforcement officials have been generally positive. There's a couple other issues that I want to talk about. First of all, and these are issues that are going to be challenges going forward for dealing with drones. Everything that I've talked about essentially so far has been federal law, FAA. What about states? What about local governments? So you may be in an area, let's say you want to fly here in Louisville. How do you know if you can fly right outside this building? Well, actually, we're outside the 5-mile limit from the airport, straight line distance. So we're not in the 5-mile where we'd have to call them up. We are in the Class C airspace, but that shouldn't matter anyway. So theoretically, you could fly under the FAA's rules. Well, what about, yes? I will be here tomorrow. You can. I will be here all day. Well, bring it up. Bring it tomorrow and we can talk about it. So under the FAA's rules, you could fly right outside this hotel. Well, what about state of Kentucky? Do they have any drone laws? I don't know. What about Louisville? Maybe they have some city ordinance that you can't fly within the downtown area. It's very difficult to necessarily know everything that's going on. There are First Amendment issues. Yeah.
So back to flying right outside the building, what about the privacy issues of people walking down the street with a camera on?
Sure. So that's another issue, and that's actually this. I'll segue into that based on this case. This was a case in Connecticut where there was a car accident, and a guy who worked for a news agency, who was also a drone flyer, flew up above the crime scene of the accident, and they approached him and asked him to take it down or to land the drone. And he charged him with interfering with a crime scene or something like that. Well, what's the difference of a news helicopter flying at 1,000 feet or a drone flying at 150 feet, which is where this guy was flying? Or the issue of someone who's standing behind the crime scene tape who's closer than he is by flying his drone. Anyway, this guy ended up, he filed a lawsuit against the government, ended up losing. It's a district court case. It's not really a precedential thing right now, but there are potential First Amendment issues. So the issue that you raised of privacy, it really comes down to a confliction of two issues, right? So generally photography is there's First Amendment issues with photography. In other words, if you're standing on public property, you can take pictures wherever you want. So the issue then is my right as a photographer to take pictures of people on the street versus their right to privacy. In that case, generally, the courts are going to say that when you're out in public, you have no expectation of privacy just walking down the street. And that's why you see surveillance cameras all over the place. Then maybe that becomes an issue. Sure, absolutely. Because people in their hotel rooms have an expectation of privacy, unless maybe the curtains are open. Then, who knows? And these are important facts. If you had one of those suites at the top floor of Caesars that have the window from the Caesars Palace in Las Vegas that have the windows from the floor to the ceiling, and you had them open all the way, well then maybe you don't have an expectation of privacy in what you're doing in the room. I also talked about Fourth Amendment issues. Some states are now passing laws that police can't use drones unless they get a warrant. So maybe that's too far. I mean, again, we're in an evolving area of law, and so it's important to think about a lot of these issues. It's not just about flying a drone. First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, privacy, regulations, FAA, state governments, local governments. It's a lot to handle for most people who are buying a drone and have no legal training. I want to play, I pray this works, some videos. So one of the things you can do, and these are just examples of things you can do with drones. This is a flight that I planned around, I'll have to stand over here. So this is a flight around the Westfield Mall in Annapolis. And this is a flight that literally you can go on a map, click the GPS waypoints, tell the altitudes you want to go to, and it'll just fly the route. And this is flying at something like 10 miles an hour, so it's not very fast. But it just goes around the outside of the mall. And just to demonstrate some of the things that you can do with drones, this is completely hands-off. I literally programmed the route into my laptop, pressed start, and it just uploads the route to the drone and flies off. You can do waypoints, so you can say, stay at this waypoint and just hover there for a minute, or do circles, or you can do routes, you can do all sorts of things.
How do you control the camera too, or is the camera just facing forward?
So the camera is generally facing at sort of at a 45-degree angle down, but I can control it to go from straight down to 90 degrees. So I have a 90-degree motion with the camera, and then I can also control the drone, obviously, in any direction. So you can pretty much do what you want. I won't show this whole thing, but I at least wanted to show some of that.
Mike, you got a question?
Okay. What's next on my list? I want to play this video. Find it. What is that? Okay. Anyway, I'm actually not going to play that video, but I want to talk a little bit about Vortex ring state. One of the issues that inexperienced pilots will have is something called vortex ring state. Question? That's a good question. What happens? Probably the same thing that would happen so his question was, what happens if my drone crashes and hits a person or a car or something like that? So how do you deal with that? Probably the same thing that would happen if my car hit his car or if I hit him. It's probably just a tort accident. In other words, it's an accident. They happen. If he wants to file a claim against me, if I hurt his insurance, he probably can, and that's probably how it's going to go down. But there's been so few of those issues happening, so it's not really clear what exactly the sort of normal expectation is for that sort of thing. Some people have said they will only fly over areas where there's no people. Well, then you're going to miss out on certain things. So it's just it's a challenge for the individual person to determine what are they going to do, where are you going to fly. You see videos of people flying through fireworks. I mean, you can do it if you want, whether or not it's safe. So vortex ring state is something that happens with helicopters, and this is what happens when the helicopter is generating lift. When you're descending in a helicopter, the dirty air underneath the propellers recycles to go above the propellers, and you just have this situation where you start losing lift. And when you're falling in an aircraft and in a drone, the first thing you think about is adding power. When you add power to a vortex ring state, you actually start descending more because you're feeding the cycle of dirty air. So this actually happens with drones as well. So if you start descending really fast, you start flying into your own dirty air, and you can lose control of your drone and crash it. So while generally adding power is a good way to get out of any problem, this happens for pilots, and the drone pilots have no idea what's going on. Steer out of it. Move forward and slow down your rate of descent. Yeah. Tell me when I get to 12 minutes. Okay. So the guy, there's a fire in his neighborhood. So he started flying over the scene of the fire. I'll just let you watch. Firefighters were not happy about him flying over their scene. I will tell you, I've watched most of this video, and most of the time he's flying around the property. There's a few times when he flies directly over it, but he's up pretty high. For the most part, he's not over where the firefighters are actually at. So that's an interesting one. But that's an issue. Is this guy doing anything wrong? Is he doing anything that a news helicopter is maybe he's lower, so maybe that's an issue. How many of you have read about this case where this guy here in Kentucky took a shot at a guy who was spying on his daughter, right? That's what you read in the news. So I will tell you, based on experience, this right here, he's flying at about 150 to 200 feet. That's what he said. And so he's looking down now. Somewhere in there is the guy's home. But he's flying at about 200 feet. That's where he shot it down. So I think in the news he had claimed that it was something like 10 feet or something like that. As you can see, it clearly was not. Skip over a couple. Anti-drone drones. So this is a big drone that carries a net and essentially flies after another drone and drops the net to bring it down. All sorts of things you can do these days. Talk about a couple of resources that are available to you. Oh, Mel, maybe not quite yet. The FAA recently put out an app called Before You Fly. And essentially this is the way of the FAA saying, hey, if you want to fly, there's these airports and these things around you. And they can, and this promoting awareness. However, the FAA, because they're the FAA, only released this beta to 1,000 users. Who does that? So unless you were one of those 1,000 users, you can't actually use the app yet. So it is what it is. There's another, there's a website called airmap.io. You can just go to any geographic location. You can click on airspace. This is actually the map for Louisville. I zoomed out a little bit. The orange circles are 5-mile radiuses from an airport. And then the purple is the Class C airspace for Louisville. So you can see that where the geo point is, we're actually outside of the 5-mile limit, so you don't have to contact the tower, but we are in the Class B airspace, or Class C airspace. So maybe you should contact the tower. But anyway, it's not really clear what you're supposed to do if my presentation hasn't already brought that across. Again, it's notify the tower, not you don't have to ask for permission. You just notify them. There's another website called noflyzone.org where you can put in your address and they're creating a database of people who don't want drones flying over their house. Whether or not anybody would actually follow those rules is another question.
There's an issue where somebody could put your address in, you wouldn't be able to fly your own zone in your yard because...
So the way that it works is that they maintain a database, and then the idea is that they want manufacturers to put essentially geofences around those points. And that's a good point. I don't know that that's been raised. I don't know what their validation process is. But certainly it seems like someone could do that, right? You could, or just put the neighbors in, you know. There's a Facebook page called The Law of Drones. You may want to follow it if you're on Facebook. It might have something to do with me. And as I leave time for questions, I do want to show one more video that I will just let roll during the questions. Find it. I will just let this roll, and I will take your questions for the next 6 minutes, 7 minutes. Yes? Sure. So he asked about commercial use regarding people posting videos to YouTube. There's a guy who lived in Florida who was posting videos on YouTube, and his YouTube account was monetized. So the FAA sent him an enforcement letter and asked him to take down the videos, even though he hadn't actually reached the level where he had gotten any money from Google, because they only send you money after you reach like $100, and he had like 14 cents or something like that. But the FAA sort of backed away from that and then said that was sort of a investigator off on his own. So they haven't been going after people since that incident. I haven't seen any of those cases, but there may have been. So just to go back, FAA administrative agencies like to exert the full extent of their power. So if you go to the FAA right now, they will tell you they control the airspace to the ground. In other words, flying something like this. This is a drone. Doesn't have a camera. Fits in the palm of your hand. A nice little controller for it. Flies for a few minutes. It's actually really difficult to fly because it's so light and these propellers produce so much thrust that's really difficult to control. But if you're flying something like this in your backyard, the FAA would say, they're not going to do anything about it, but they would say they have jurisdiction over it. Yes?
So, aircrafts they're above the ground, but what about like projectiles? Like, I have the right to shoot my own bow in my yard, but yet that's technically in their airspace.
You probably could argue that a projectile, like a bow, is not an aircraft, and therefore that they can't control it, or they don't have the authority to regulate it. But anything that flies, they could conclaim. Again, they're not going to go after what people are doing in their backyard, probably, but they claim they have the authority to do this. Is that the one where he went right through the? Yeah. Question. So he asked about the AMA and insurance. There are a couple of places that will give insurance to drones, but generally those insurance will have to do with insuring the drone itself. Some people have doing that, insuring drones. The other issue would be like liability insurance, and it's a nascent industry, the insurance industry for drones. They might have something for drone users too. I wouldn't be surprised. Okay, yeah. The question would be then, my question, because I don't know about it, would be whether it covers commercial uses, which it may not. Right. So if you're a commercial user, you probably want to have that liability insurance, but is there anybody who's actually going to give it to you? If you just search for like drone crashes, you can find stuff like this all over the internet. It's great. Yes? High altitude balloons is all I heard. Yes, so balloon, like regulations of them? So you have to, so balloon launches for like high altitude going up to like 100,000 feet sort of thing, I think you have to notify the FAA, but there's not a lot of other regulation of that. And NOAA launches like several hundred weather balloons a day into the atmosphere, and as far as I know, they've never had any incidents with aircraft issues. So those are generally not an issue, but I think you still have to notify the FAA about it. Other questions? Yes.
Do you put any extra equipment on yours for like cellular GPS tracking or things on the waypoint routing?
Right. So I have a Bluetooth data link that allows me to transmit waypoints. I also have a video transmitter. So I have like a little 7-inch monitor so I can see what the camera's seeing when I'm flying. DJI, the company that makes these, is the most popular sort of drones that are out there. They've taken sort of the Apple approach. They put out this, which is the version 2, and then they let people kind of hack away on it, and then they take all those things that they like and they integrated that into the next version. So they have this sort of Apple marketing approach. But that was his first flight ever. Yes. Assuming that your code, the code where you live, allows you to put it up, it's hard to say. It depends on, is it right adjacent to your house? Is it, sort of in the backyard? I think you'd have issues, as long as people aren't flying right by the tower. I think you would have issues making a good claim that someone was, for example, trespassing or something like that. But I don't know that it's been tried. Someone's going to have to try it.
What about being a hobbyist drone person who routinely uses your developing atmosphere in your own yard up to 500 feet or something? Then you can say, look, this is you assert. It's kind of like squatter first, I guess. Like
right.
Asserting control because you're there.
Again, and that's a good idea. These are all issues that haven't been litigated in the courts.
So imagine you scripting, like you don't even have to do it. Like every morning you have a spare drone you don't care about.
Take off,
Around your yard and like glance again.
and you just document it. I fly every day up to 400 feet. Who knows? These are things that have to be worked out in the courts, and that's where they're going to end up. At least from the hobbyist community, I think we want the least amount of regulation. The other interesting thing is you have people who fly model aircraft who've been doing it for 40, 50 years, and they're not so, they don't really want to be part of the drone community, so there's a little bit of that too. One more question.
Are there any cases of people weaponizing their own, putting a gun or anything on it?
There are. There was a case a month or two ago where a guy put a handgun on a drone, and it was obviously in an area that he controlled. It was only a few feet off the ground, but he was firing it. I've also seen like people put Roman candles on drones and stuff like that. But the handgun was the only one I've seen so far. And I know maybe the FAA or somebody was looking into it, but I don't know that it went any further than that. But people are doing it. If you can think it, someone's probably doing it. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it.